By now, you'll probably have heard of the Wagner Group, that shadowy group of mercenaries fighting alongside Russian forces in Ukraine. But like me, you probably don't know much about their leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, although you may well have seen footage of him recruiting soldiers from inmates in a Russian prison. One of his latest videos was published on Telegram, the Russian-founded social medium, which has proved a hotbed for cranks and conspiracy theorists. It's filmed in Bakhmut, a city in the east of Ukraine, which has seen some of the war's worst fighting. These guys here are Wagner men who have died today, he says. The blood is fresh. The camera then turns to show tens of bodies lying on the ground. Prigozhin angrily addresses the camera again. Now listen to me, you. These are someone's father and someone's son. And those who are not giving us any ammunition will be in hell munching on their insides. We have a 70% shortage of ammunition. Prigozhin then directly addresses the Russian defense minister and the head of Russia's armed forces. Shoigu, Gerasimov, where is the ammunition? Now, understandably, the international media were quick to pick up on those remarks. After all, it is not often you see such language directed at those so close to Vladimir Putin. So, just who is Yevgeny Prigozhin, a man who, at least at one time, was so close to the Kremlin, he was known as Putin's chef? I'm Niall Paterson, and this is the Sky News Daily. Well, let's speak to a couple of academics who know an awful lot about Russia, and let's start with Prigozhin himself.
He was born in St. Petersburg, which is the same town that Vladimir Putin was born in. And this is a very important detail because Vladimir Putin and Yevgeny Prigozhin have known each other for a very long time.
Samantha de Bendern is Associate Fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs.
Prigozhin is a former con man. He was a thug. He was put in prison in the 1980s for basically assaulting a woman in the street. He spent quite a number of years in the Soviet Union's penitentiary system. And this is something that's very visible even today. When he records videos, he often uses prison slang. And when you consider the fact that a lot of the Russian population has passed through the prisons, you can understand the appeal that this has. He then left prison just as perestroika and glasnost were happening in the Soviet Union.
Well, that, of course, was the period in the 90s when Russia was opening up to the world under President Gorbachev.
He very quickly got onto the private property, private enterprise bandwagon and ended up being a hot dog seller. And this is where things become very mysterious because he transformed himself from hot dog seller to restaurateur for the grand and great new post-Soviet Russian elite. Now, one thing that's important to understand in the Soviet Union, indeed, in the dying days when private enterprise was allowed, you could not get ahead in any kind of business, even being a lowly hot dog seller, if you didn't have some kind of mafia protection. And in the Soviet Union, and as it morphed into Russia, mafia and government became very blurred. The lines became very blurred. Now, Prigozhin really made his fortune when he became caterer to a number of Russian state concerns, including the Russian army. He was also the person who was catering to a lot of Putin's state visits. He's met presidents, he's met heads of state. There are even letters that were written to him, one by President Jacques Chirac, who was entertained on Prigozhin's boat restaurant in St. Petersburg. But what you have to understand in Russia is that the links between crime and business have increased, particularly when you are that involved in providing services to the state and that close to Vladimir Putin.
When you say that close to Vladimir Putin, can we quantify that? In what way did these two men have anything other than, a professional relationship?
Well, that is the big question, and those are the murky areas. The fact that they come from St. Petersburg, that they both participated in the period of business opening up being supervised by crime. The fact that Vladimir Putin asked Yevgeny Prigozhin to become the Kremlin's chef is something very important to understand, because Putin has been very paranoid for a very long time. And putting his food into somebody's hands is an enormous vote of trust.
So, look, from the mid-90s onwards, we know Prigozhin is in Putin's circle, and once Putin becomes president in 2000, he begins to get government contracts, including catering for the Russian army. And then at some point in the 2010s, he buys the Wagner Group, a mercenary company. And we're going to get more on the group in just a second. But this gets us to the point, doesn't it, Samantha, where Yevgeny Prigozhin first comes to the public's attention. It was all the way back at the end of 2022 with that remarkable video, which appeared to show him recruiting for Wagner directly from Russian prisons, from Russian prisoners. Now, what did that tell us about Prigozhin's relationship with Putin?
Well, what was really interesting about this video is that it actually appeared, because these kind of videos don't appear unless they're allowed to appear. Until then, Yevgeny Prigozhin was actually denying having any links to Wagner. And all of a sudden, September, late August, early September 2022, Yevgeny Prigozhin comes out publicly recruiting prisoners in Russia's prisons for the so-called special military operation. So a number of things are really interesting here, apart from the fact that Yevgeny Prigozhin came out of the cupboard. It's the fact that when you're in Russia, the prison service is under the control of the internal ministry. It's a government-controlled operation. And here is this businessman, the head of a private army, being allowed to go to prisons, but not only being allowed to go to prisons, but offering pardons to prisoners who would become soldiers, serve for 6 months, and if they survive, they will be pardoned. Now, under Russian law, only the parliament or the president can actually pardon a prisoner. So, again, we have this legal vacuum, which has raised a lot of questions as to Prigozhin's power. Like, how can this man, who's a businessman, have the power to do something which is the state's prerogative?
So we have a man of means whose power grows alongside, or perhaps even because of that of Putin. But it is with Wagner that he has cemented his influence. Joana de Deus Pereira is Senior Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, Europe.
Originally, they were offering different types of services. They included not only military support, but also intelligence gathering, training in several countries in Africa, for example. Also logistics, support for logistics. Actually, most of the services at the beginning were more related to the ones that private security companies provide. We were talking initially about former highly trained Russian military. So at the beginning, their standard, even in terms of recruitment and activities, was very, very rigorous, I would say. And they were paying rather well at the beginning. At the beginning, they were rather small, and they became more evident when Prigozhin had this big window of opportunity during the annexation of Crimea. They handled the situation quite smoothly, without bloodshed. And basically, the Kremlin saw on them a potential useful tool for other scenarios where Russia had interest.
I mean, I remember people talking about the little green men, those soldiers that were operating in eastern Ukraine, Crimea, without markings, without designation that would show you to which army they belonged. Tell us a little bit about that.
So before the invasion of Crimea, some of them were already in the territory, those little green men. So that is why it was so quiet, so silent. They were the ones who facilitated the entry of the Russian army. So they became known because they were not wearing military insignia, although their uniforms were quite similar to the Russian. They were using Russian weaponry. They were also training next to training sites of official Russian military. So there was always this blurriness between what they did and what the Russian military did. So it was very difficult to understand who was who and who belonged to which organization during this period.
Well, who now comprise the Wagner Group mercenaries. I mean, you mentioned earlier on that there was at least a perception for a time that they had worked quite effectively in parts of the world, which suggests to me well-trained, former military. But at the moment, Wagner does seem to be heavily recruiting from the gulags, from the prisons.
Yes, yes. From the gulags, from prisons, from basically they recruited whoever said yes or whoever wished to join their ranks, not even for a good salary, because this is no longer the case.
In terms of what they have been tasked with on the ground in Ukraine, just describe to me the type of operations that the Russian military have been using these mercenaries for.
Well, we cannot say that the Russian military are using the mercenaries. This would be an acknowledgement that they recognize them as partners on the ground. I believe that at this precise moment, Prigozhin and Wagner are acting on a kind of rogue moves, and they are not being officially backed by the Russian military.
Do we have evidence of the Wagner Group committing war crimes in Ukraine?
Wow. This is a very sensitive question. There are several indications that they were present in Bucha and that the same modus operandi was used in Mora in Africa. So I would say yes.
Joanna, just on that point then, I mean, France has designated Wagner a terror group, the British government moving in that direction as well. I mean, is there any chance, though, that, that designation by the United Kingdom, by France, perhaps by the European Union as a whole, will have any effect on Yevgeny Prigozhin?
Honestly, I don't think so. I don't want to be cynical, and I want to be pragmatical. So it is a very symbolic gesture if several countries, or even the European Union or the United States, take this huge step. But in practical terms, I would say that this will affect the activities of Wagner Group very little, especially because they already proved that they can easily reorganize themselves. Probably for Prigozhin, it will be more difficult because he has become so visible during the war in Ukraine. But Wagner Group is not only Prigozhin. So Wagner Group is an octopus-like organization that is well established in several countries in Africa and that will survive after Prigozhin, probably with another name.
Yevgeny Prigozhin is clearly a man of significant means and influence, but he has, on more than one occasion, directly criticised those at the top of the Russian chain of command. And that, of course, comes very close to maligning Putin himself. And he's not a man known for his tolerance of independent thought. Samantha.
Well, there's been actually an escalation in Prigozhin's criticism of the Russian leadership when he began to criticize the Ministry of Defense and certain individuals within the Ministry of Defense, the Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, the head of General Staff Valery Gerasimov, a number of generals. He's been criticizing them openly, using their names, for quite a few months right now. He's been criticizing what he calls the bureaucrats and the bureaucracy. Sounds a bit like a Brexiteer sometimes when they put that on the side. So he's been upping his criticism, and the latest criticism of the Ministry of Defense, saying basically all these dead boys you see behind me are dead because you, the Ministry of Defense, did not give me artillery shells. But just after the 9th of May, so after Putin's speech on the 9th of May morning, Prigozhin came out with 2 other videos. And these were really interesting because he starts talking about a grandfather. He calls it, the Russian one is dedushka, and he also uses the expression ded. Now, the Russians, and particularly when Russians are being disrespectful towards Putin, they call him the dedushka, the ded, the grandfather. So Prigozhin was saying, yes, so, there's this grandfather who thinks everything is fine, but, he needs to be told that everything isn't fine. And what if this grandfather was an absolute, complete idiot? But he uses a word that's a lot worse than idiot.
We'll paraphrase.
But a pretty horrible swear words. And this has been seen by a lot of the Russian, both pro-war and anti-war bloggers, the Telegram sphere. A lot of questions have been asked as to, is he actually referring to Putin here?
But is this all about then political positioning? Is Prigozhin perhaps, setting himself up as an alternative, a future alternative to Putin? The reason I say that, it was only last month he gave an interview to Russia's federal news agency in which the parallels between the way in which he conducted himself in that interview and the way in which Vladimir Putin sits and holds interviews and public appearances, it's very distinctive. It certainly felt as if he was trying to ape it. He's at least poking the bear a little bit, isn't he?
I think he is. Now, there are a lot of discussions amongst the think tank community, amongst the Russia specialists. A lot of people have different opinions on what Prigozhin is doing. Some people will say Prigozhin is not doing anything without Putin's approval. I actually think that he is a puppet who's now cutting his puppet strings and trying to become the puppet master himself. He's behaving like a populist politician. He's positioning himself as the only one who is telling people the truth of what's happening on the front lines. Now, whether or not he really is lacking artillery shells is a question, and it could be a part of his show and this sort of absurd theatre that he seems to be creating. But in terms of the losses, in terms of the dire situation that the Russian troops are in terms of the dire situation of the Russian army, he's the only person who's telling the truth, the man who's at the head of an organisation that people are calling terrorists. It's a very, very bizarre situation.
So, Joanna, back to you on this. If we assume that Prigozhin is telling the truth about the lack of ammunition that he's receiving, but what does that say about the relationship between the Russian military and the Wagner Group? I've got two words for you: cannon fodder. Does that adequately describe how the Russian military is using the Wagner Group?
Completely. And I think now it's more than cannon fodder. I think he is an embarrassment right now for the Kremlin. He is not recognized amongst the highest spheres of the Kremlin. And this is what, in a certain way, declare is imminent downfall. We are seeing a desperate man that tries also desperate moves to have the attention of Vladimir Putin, and trying also to be recognized as someone who is doing something patriotic for the mother Russia. So he is the one staying, he is the one sacrificing their men in Bakhmut. And this is far, far, far away from ending.
Because Vladimir Putin considers him as a threat, because he hasn't proved to be of use? What's the explanation?
No, because Vladimir Putin considers him not a threat, but a liability. I've said this many times before. I do not believe that Prigozhin wants Vladimir Putin's place, for example. What he wants is recognition. He wants desperately to be recognized for the sacrifices, for the deaths of the young Russians that were killed in the name of Russia, but wearing the uniforms of Wagner. So Putin doesn't see him as a threat, but a huge liability, because we have seen how he behaves. He doesn't play by the official Russian playbook.
So, Samantha, how secure then do you think Prigozhin's position is back in Russia? Well, I suppose it depends on whether he ever gets out of Bakhmut.
Well, there are people who say he's probably safer in Bakhmut than in Russia these days. There have been a number of terrorist attacks, because that's what one could call them, of far-right military bloggers with links to Prigozhin. There was the bomb that went off in St. Petersburg on the 2nd of April that killed someone called Vladimir Tatarsky, who was in a cafe owned by Prigozhin. There was another pro-war blogger called Prilepin who was badly injured when a car bomb went off a few days ago in Russia. The Russian government has said, this is Ukrainian saboteurs, terrorists, special services. Prigozhin has actually said each time, I don't think this is the Ukrainians. I think this is some kind of intra-Russian warfare. And whatever one thinks about whether he's controlled by Putin or not, Prigozhin is definitely creating a rift between the Ministry of Defense and his own private army, and a rift between his private armies and other private armies. So you really have got fertile ground here for what I could only call civil war.
My thanks to Joana de Deus Pereira and Samantha de Bendern, and of course to you for listening to the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson. This episode was produced by Rosie Gillett with Alex Eden. Our editor is Philly Moment.